Thank you to everyone for checking out another podcast. I'm really happy today to have Professor Joe Hamm from Michigan State University with me. He's a professor in the criminology department there, and he studies public trust in policing. And with what's been happening around the country, it's a fascinating conversation that we have. And the most interesting part to me is that he starts by asking a question, what needs to happen before we can even begin the process of building trust. So I encourage you to stick around and listen and to subscribe and to share. Thank you so much for your time. Hey, thanks again. Thanks again for coming. I already gave like a brief intro, but I always found that before I talk with someone about their interests, it's always interesting to find out a little bit about who they are and the lens that they've developed over time to see the material with which they view the material. So maybe you can just tell me like where you grew up a little bit.
Yeah. So my parents were actually military, which means I kind of grew up a little bit of everywhere. So we were about 4 years in each place that we were. I think probably the most formative, though, was Georgia. So Georgia or Colorado were probably where I spent most of my time.
Air Force?
Army, actually. My mom was Air Force until I was born, but then Army.
Okay, and in Georgia, where were you? Fort Benning, or where were you?
Fort Benning.
Okay, I was stationed at Fort Benning for a while.
Oh, right on.
Yeah, I went to airborne school there, and I went to basic training and AIT.
Yeah.
I did some ranger training there, so I'm very familiar with Georgia.
I saw some pictures of the jump towers the other day and had a bit of a nostalgic moment.
Oh yeah. My whole below my waist, my knees and ankles have nostalgia every morning when I look at it.
I don't envy that.
Don't envy it. So you moved around a lot. Was there some kind of like experience or set of experiences or people you knew or some sort of thing that led you to study? Because you study sort of police and trust and police, and what sort of drew you here? What brought you here?
Yeah. So when I started undergrad, I'd had some conversations and starting to have a lot of fun conversations with friends about like criminal profiling kinds of things. And so I thought criminal justice was definitely the way for it to go for an undergrad degree, not knowing at all how wrong I was about trying to make that connection between them. But I got started, and in one of my early CJ classes, a professor gave a presentation, Doug Woody, he's at University of Northern Colorado. And he gave a presentation about law psych, and it clicked for me. And that was really what I cared about and what I wanted to do. So I worked with him on a jury decision-making project. And after I graduated undergrad, I did an NSF RU, just kind of like try out this grad school thing for undergrads. I did that at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, also in jury decision-making. And then started grad school knowing I was absolutely going to do jury decision-making and almost immediately stopped doing jury decision-making. But I was moved into a project that my advisor had looking at attitudes towards the courts. And we had an initial problem we just wanted a measure. We just wanted a measure of trust in the courts. And so I was kind of sent off on this mission along with another colleague of mine to go find a good measure of trust. And it took so much time and was such a complicated question that ended up being a big chunk of what we did as part of that research team for the whole time I was in grad school. And I fell in love with it. And I've just never gotten out.
Okay. So it's sort of like it was more of an academic route. So your intellectual interests brought you to a space, and you guys identified sort of a hole in the literature, and you found love with filling these gaps in the literature.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it was. What makes me laugh about it, and I'm sure this is just me being self-indulgent, but what makes me laugh is that I kept having aha moments to things that didn't end up being where I was. So I was like, oh, it's this. And then I took that road to find another place. And it just kind of kept happening.
So like kind of piecing things together, like a little bit of a puzzle.
Yeah.
So I've always been, one of the things I'm really interested in is public trust in policing. And so I would have been interested in this before these uprisings and the murder in Minneapolis, but a lot of people's attention has been drawn to this subject matter. And I think while I was interested before this, I'm in the process of changing. So like my perspective on things, I'm unsure of a lot of things, and I'm in the process of changing my views on everything, including trust and policing. And I recently saw you had made a post in social media, which is there's a lot of communication taking place on this topic, and I just wanted to maybe, if you could just for a minute, how you your perspectives may have been or in flux. I'm not
Yeah.
saying this. I'm going to just turn it
Yeah.
over to you. You just tell us a little bit what you said and where you are.
Yeah, no, for sure. So that was probably the first of my, what I'm lovingly referring to as my frustrated posts of the last couple of weeks. But what I'm finding in myself is, as I'm dealing with my own personal frustration, it obviously is so closely attached to what I research and what I study, that I keep trying to have this professional, research-based, theoretically based kind of foot in my Twitter profile, which is where this was. And so I keep finding myself really excited when I've got something that allows me to kind of hit both my personal frustration and my research interests. And so what I was trying to say in that particular post was that there are a lot of conversations about the nexus of the riots and the existence or the absence of public trust, and what it means for people to while people are protesting, what that means for trust, and what the reforms that the police do on the other end of this, what impact that would have on public trust. And what I was trying to argue in that post is that we're not really in a moment of trust right now. This question of what should police be doing to rebuild public trust feels kind of like the wrong one. So trust is really rooted in uncertainty. Trust is rooted in the fact that, when people interact with each other, both of them can make decisions, and those decisions could result in harm to the other person. And so trust is what we use as humans to navigate that question of, there is someone else who's around me. That other person can make a decision. That decision could hurt me. How do I feel about that? And how do I react to them in that space? And that takes on a whole nother level when we're talking about government, because of the power differential that sits there.
Right.
There's real potential for real injury in a way that maybe when you're walking into an elevator with someone else, it's still a question of trust whether or not you get into that elevator, but it doesn't have necessarily the same repercussions that some of the government questions do.
They usually don't have the legal right to kick your ass in the elevator.
The idea that there's this power structure, when you're getting into an elevator with someone, you can call the police if something goes wrong, and if the police don't do something, then maybe you can go to the courts and have something civil. You lose some of that structure when the other person is government. Whether you lose it in fact or you lose it in perspective is an argument I can't speak to. Like I can't say that the courts wouldn't come to your aid if something happened with the police. I mean, obviously there are cases where they have and there are cases where they haven't, and that's a thing for a legal scholar to debate in a way that I just don't have the expertise for. But at least in the minds of the people who are in that interaction, it's the who do you call when the cops are the problem question.
Right.
It's different when you're talking about government.
Yeah, and as a person, one of the things so I've been involved in use of force incidents plenty when I was an officer. Sure. And what we would do is, just like any other organization, you rely on the people with expertise to handle a certain problem that you encounter. So when we would use of force, it was never the officer that used force who wrote the report. It was always another officer on the squad. And I was probably the best writer on my squad most of the time. I was a good writer compared to most of my squad mates. It was one of my skills as an officer was writing good reports. So I was always selected to write, not always, but a lot of the time, to write that report, because I had the ability to articulate things in such a way as to make it more palatable to anyone that might review it.
Yeah.
So there's when you enter that relationship with the police, it's not as though on the other side of that encounter, there's going to be some fair articulation of what actually happened. Mm-hmm. It's going to be the narrative that's created surrounding that event is going to be generated by people who have an emotional and professional attachment to the individuals who use the violence. So even if it's justified, it's made to sound more justified than it was, and if it was borderline, so I really appreciate that point, because it's different when you're with the police. It's very different. So what is that?
The power difference isn't just about what you can do to hurt the other person. It's control over the process. It's exactly like you're talking about. Once something happens, you don't have equal footing in terms of this is the cop story and this is the person's story. And even when you stand in front of a judge and both of you disagree, you still don't have equal footing. That power differential moves through the entire process. It's not just the fact that there's a gun on their head. It's a great point that you're making, that it's not just the instrumentality. It's not just the physical thing that cop can do in the interaction. There's more that goes through that whole process.
It's like also, like, if you were to an analogy would be like the maybe, I don't know if I'm going to screw this up, but correct me if you're involved in a romantic relationship where there's a level of equality and you're building trust, is very different if, say, you're a graduate student in a romantic relationship with a professor, or when there's a discrepancy in power, it changes the nature of how trust forms. It's when you introduce power into trust, I think it changes it in a variety of venues. What do you think?
I do. So without being able to speak to your exact the concrete, like the romantic relationship part of it, power absolutely does change vulnerability. It changes how so I guess I should start with the definition of trust that I use, and that is kind of taking on favor in that wider trust literature, is this idea that it's a willingness to accept vulnerability. So it's a willingness in the person who says that I trust, to recognize, it's a recognition that the other person can make decisions that could cause harm to you, and a willingness to accept that interaction or that potential for harm. And what that means is that how you can be hurt and how you think you can be hurt are critical to what your trust assessment or the level of trust that you have. And I do think that anytime you're talking about a power differential, whether you're talking about a parent and a child, or you're talking about a romantic relationship, or you're talking about government, power changes that vulnerability, at least its perception, if not its actual reality.
So if I'm hearing you right, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that in order for us to have a public conversation about trust in the police, that we need to address the fact that there's this power discrepancy, and that is making it at the moment impossible to have this conversation, because it would first require people in our society to be willing to be vulnerable, and that's not something that happen right now. Am I right in hearing you right?
You are. The part of it that I was really focused on in that Facebook post is kind of the so what of that. Is where do you go with that? And so the piece that I would add, completely agreeing with what you just said, the piece that I would add to it is that if you want to have a conversation with someone about how you start to help them be willing to accept vulnerability to you, you kind of need to start from the basis of something that makes real sense. And I don't think that it is the right answer for people to ask the public to trust the police until the police are reformed. I think if you're in a context where you are constantly experiencing harm, if you're in a context where there's constant injury, perceived or real, and I think it's pretty fair to assume that a lot of this is very real, but I don't mean to make that argument. When you're talking about a situation where there's no question anymore, there's no uncertainty in their mind. There is a problem here that has to be fixed. And I think there's a lot of volume behind the argument that a few bad apples arguments just isn't good enough anymore.
Right. Agreed.
And that you can make the argument that, most of the time we get this right, but when it's wrong, it's so wrong. And it's wrong in a way that needs a more serious look and a more serious attempt to fix something than I think has necessarily happened in the past. And until that platform is built, I don't know why. I don't know what you say to a member of the public when you're trying to get them to trust you. I mean, how do you enter that conversation and say, I recognize my power, I recognize my position, I recognize that I can do more to hurt you, but you should be okay with that potential for me to hurt you, with everything sitting right behind you in that moment. You have to clean that up first. You have to figure out, you have to make real effort you have to successfully make changes that make that baseline different before it really makes any sense to If you'll indulge me, one of the places that this idea kind of clicked for me, I guess, in my own thinking about trust is when I was doing work in Flint. So I was doing work in Flint after the water crisis, and all we really wanted to do in that was to understand the community experience. So there wasn't this, we tried really hard not to bring this, academic, here's what's going on, here's what should happen, here's our theories we want to test, here's what we want to understand. It was one of the first projects that I had ever been involved in that really just wanted to understand that phenomenon and wanted to understand it from the perspective of trust. And one of the things that, from my own development, both as a researcher and as a human, was so impactful for me was recognizing that the whole time during the entire water crisis, people kept talking about how this is a crisis of trust. And it was not, the conversation was not as often that this is a crisis of water. Mm-hmm. That, until that water was fit, until that water was safe, until that threat and that harm and that injury was gone, talking about trust it betrayed the injury that people were experiencing. It ignored the injury that they were experiencing. You have to fix that first. And power, I think, plays into it, just like you were saying. That was my rant on Twitter, though.
No, I agree. I think it's, and if you're involved in bring it back to like an interpersonal level, because that's when I think about trust, that's for me as a human being, it's the most natural environment for me to understand it. And like, because it's a complex idea, but I can understand it on an individual level. And it makes sense to me that if I'm in a relationship, an interpersonal relationship with another person, and they were to consistently hurt me and over and over again, and then I was asked that they said, I'm sorry, we need to build trust, that I at a certain point would say, well, I love you and I want to trust you, but before I do that, you need to change. You need to go away and fix yourself before you can come to me and ask me to trust you, because I'm consistently making myself vulnerable and you keep hurting me. And so when I think about a huge population, when you scale it up, it's really the same. It's just a bunch of individual experiences mashed together.
Yeah. There are people who would disagree with me on this, but I do think that trust itself is not a different phenomenon depending on who's involved in it. There are different elements of it that matter, but I do think it's completely appropriate to talk about your experience of trust in an interpersonal relationship and think about what it means to ask for someone's trust in an interpersonal relationship, and then scale that to law enforcement. I think you're absolutely right that what you're talking about is a bunch of individuals doing very natural human assessments of evaluating these relationships in light of the uncertainty that they have about what happens next. And just applying that same, they're looking at different things. Obviously, you're not looking for a romantic partner's ability to correctly use a firearm. Like, you're looking at different things.
Sure.
But you're making similar assessments.
They're different toolkits, but it's the same sort of underlying like the fundamental dynamics are very similar. And
it's the argument I want to make, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it makes, like I said, it's to me as a human being, it's intuitive. Like, that's the best for me. The best theory is when I hear it and I'm like, no one said that before, because that's obvious. That's the best theory. And I think that it's important too with policing to take it down to an individual level, because I think one of the problems that I've identified with policing is that the institution dehumanizes. So when you're a police officer, as time goes by, the individuals, and I notice this while working and through my observations as a scholar, as time goes by, officers turn human beings into work product. Like they're someone, and I notice myself still saying the words like, I would deal with this person, or I would deal with this group of people. I didn't deal with that. I wasn't interacting, or I so often was, but being institutionalized as a police officer, you go through a process where you turn people into work product that you manage, and you go through this. So I think it's important that when we talk about trust, we talk about reconceiving what we think of what it means to police in this country. We need to bring it down to an individual level and treat people like human beings first and foremost. So that's another thing I appreciate about thinking about it like at this lower level. So what do, and I know, shit, this is like not an easy question. I don't know if this is even a fair question to ask, but if we want to make change in this this institution before we readdress trust, can you tell me, like, for someone who's confused about where to go next, what do you think we should do? Like, what do you think we should do? What's some tangible sort of things we can do?
So what I can't do is tell you what the tactics or the policies or the funding strategies that apply to law enforcement that make sense are. I just don't know. I don't study policing. I study the way that policing impacts people, but my expertise is not in that institution itself. On the flip side of that, what I have not done is sat down with people who are part of this protest, people who are part of these this moment in the public's reaction to law enforcement. I've not sat down with these civil groups. I've not sat down with these people with these interests to be able to understand what it is specifically that they're demanding. And so my answer is probably going to be a little bit disappointing, but what I can offer is that if you want to ask someone to trust you, you have to understand their potential for harm, and it has to be from their perspective. So often what I feel like I hear, and this is happily less true right now, it was more true, I think, in the aftermath of Ferguson, but so much of what I heard was this conversation of, I don't understand why they think we're all so bad. I don't understand why we don't really need to do a whole lot of changes. We don't really need to make systemic change to law enforcement, because what's happening is that they're misunderstanding who we are. And all we need to do is get them to see it our way, and they'll recognize that this vulnerability that they're not comfortable with is just a misunderstanding. You can't start there. You can't start from this understanding that the way that someone feels vulnerable to you is incorrect and needs to be recalibrated so that then you can tell them why they should trust you. It has to be about what they think and what they feel and what they believe. And that creates a really difficult situation for law enforcement. That is part of why I'm punting on the question of how you reform it.
I don't think this is a punt at all. Continue, please.
I appreciate it. I was hoping I could give you something that was a real answer for this.
I think this is a real answer. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
Continue.
No worries. I think that there are police agencies that are doing things in ways that make sense and that do objectively address people's vulnerabilities. And there are agencies that have publics that look at them and don't see that. And the problem there is not that the public is wrong. The problem there is not that the public needs to be educated. I mean, there have been years of all of the criminal justice system trying to build trust simply by presenting information, simply by saying, here's who we are, here's what we do, here's how we do it, now you trust us, right? Like, it isn't to say that no one in these criminal justice organizations is doing things right. It's always that the public is factually accurate, that the conversation about building trust has to be about addressing the vulnerability in the minds of people who are trusting. It's their perspective, it's their experience, it's their willingness, and it can't be superimposed on them.
Right. So it may not matter relying on so it can't be police department saying, well, the statistics tell us this, so you need to really adjust the way you think. It needs to be more saying, it doesn't really matter what matters is that how people feel about this.
We're listening, we're attending to this. That information from law enforcement should be tailored to those vulnerabilities. Right. It should be that we hear what you're saying and let me show you what it is we're doing that's addressing that. And this is part of the reason why I don't think that this conversation is one of trust, because what that leads you to is a conversation. That leads you to is, you say you're really worried about this particular type of injury as law enforcement. I'm telling you, this is what we're doing to fix that. You trust me, right? You believe that that's okay. You believe that's going to change things. you can't have that conversation with someone in the context of constantly hurting them. So the reform has to happen first. But once there is that meaningful, real reform happening, the steps towards building trust are listening, and listening specifically to that potential for harm that people feel from their perspective, and then getting into that and addressing that.
Okay. I appreciate it. So I'm going to do something really, it might be a little awkward, but now I'm going to ask you questions about why. So we just had this long conversation about why we're not ready to talk about trust, which I agree with. But now I'm going to ask you about trust. And I still think it's important because our inability to create an environment where we can begin the process of talking about trust, we still need to recognize that we need to get there because it is important.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted, if you could just a little bit talk about why we need to make these changes so that we can make people feel vulnerable, so that we can begin the process of building trust, and why building trust. So for a police, so I don't even know if it will be called the police department when this happens, but for a social control organization that utilizes the threat of coercive force to compel,
Mm-hmm.
for whatever that looks like, why is it important when that power discrepancy exists and that vulnerability exists? Why is it important for police agencies to have public trust?
So starting really broad, the reason why trust is needed for a society is because we can't predict others' behavior. And so anytime two individuals are going to interact, they call it the social lubricant that allows that interaction, that allows for there to be an efficient exchange of interaction between those two people, is that they're willing to accept the reality that the other person could make a decision that could hurt them. That if you don't have that, people tend to not want to interact. People tend to try not to interact. People tend to take less chances. They tend to take less risk. They tend to want more oversight. They tend to want more things to step into that relationship that really make it less efficient, that make it less functioning. And so there are social theory, some of the social theory really argues that a functioning society can only really exist when there's this ability to get past what makes things predictable, what makes things obvious, what makes things underlying. We've moved past a point in history where we're all part of the same tribe. And so the behavior of someone else who's around you, it requires some level of trust for you to be able to interact with them without all these other pressures. Scale that up to the police. If there is a police force or there is an institution of social control, its goal is typically to be that additional, more powerful thing that helps direct the behavior of others we interact with. And so sharing you're not knowing what this looks like in the other end, I have no idea what this thing looks like. But if this is something that is empowered, it's something that has more potential to hurt. And so it becomes more important that this thing is trusted in order for there to be any kind of efficient operation of it. The flip side of this, though, is that there is at least an argument that the need to trust these kinds of organizations creates it's a psychological need. Most people, there's an argument that most people want to be able to trust government. There's an argument that most people want to be able to trust the things that are supposed to protect them. And that's kind of a default setting for us because it is psychologically positive for us to be able to wake up in the morning and say, I trust these things. I feel comfortable with the fact that something could happen. And so there's both the efficiency of law enforcement side of it, but there's also the psychological need that people have for the things that are around them that could hurt them to be things that they can feel some level of trust in. And so to have a functioning society, you need some level of trust. To have a functioning government, it needs some level of that difference. And to have a functioning human, they need to have the ability to trust the things that are supposed to protect them.
And I know for myself, like I've lost a considerable amount of trust in government over the years, these past years. And I can feel the anxiety that induces.
It does.
And it does. And like this sense that I had growing up that there was this set of institutions that were functioning, and that at some sort of basic level, push come to shove, that I could rely on them in some way to be fair arbiters of my future, and I could rely on them to rely on the rule of law, I don't know what it was, but I had this sense of security. And then now, having been on the other side of being an agent of social control and learning more about it and experiencing learning more about what America really is, I've lost a considerable amount of that, and I'm in a very privileged position. So, like, my spouse is a assistant professor at a university. I have medical care. I have a house to live in. I have people don't give me a problem when I walk down the street. People, like, I have a pretty easy go of it. So I can imagine if you were a person who is targeted by society and the state in an adversarial way, that it would be extremely anxiety. It would be a huge anxiety and an unhealthy thing.
Could be, yeah, for sure.
And I know it trickles down into, I don't know. I mean, I can talk to that. I mean, just on a functional level, I've been an investigator, so I've investigated homicides, I've investigated, burglaries, robberies, a whole bunch of different types of crimes. And I also am a policing scholar, and I know that for any type of successful criminal investigation, if someone murders somebody, you need witnesses, you need victims, you need friends and family of the victims to be willing to interview you. To be willing to be interviewed and to give you honest information, and to cooperate and go to trial and testify and take on all of these burdens. It's really a community effort to successfully prosecute an offender in the criminal justice system. And it cannot happen without, and I am sorry to go off on a tangent. And I've mentioned,
no, this is right.
But I had a very sort of traumatic experience with this, where I was involved in an officer-involved shooting. I was attacked by a person, and I was positioned between the victim of the domestic violence call and the suspect, and ended up having to shoot the person who was attacking us. And the person died. And when I was being interviewed by the homicide detectives, the victim had fled. And the reason they had fled was because they were scared Sheriff Joe Arpaio was going to deport them, even though they were there as a victim and not an offender. Eventually they were found and gave a statement and corroborated my account of what happened. But to just think that, like, even police are vulnerable because of this lack of trust. When the community doesn't trust you, it could put you at, and I have a lot of officers who listen to this, so that's why I'm saying this, it puts you at risk as well.
No, it definitely does. Trust is a two-way street. There is both sides of it. Every time people talk about how trust is a two-way street, I always get nervous that the power differential gets lost in that conversation, where we're just as vulnerable as you are, and we're just as vulnerable as we are. But I do completely agree that it is always two-way. It is always, both sides can make decisions that can hurt the other side.
Right. And it's not, and obviously they're not equal sides they're not at all. I didn't mean to equate them in any way.
No. I don't mean that you did. I just,
but that does happen. I do hear that. And I've noticed that as a major response that's bothered me from a lot of my officer friends is that they'll say, yeah, but now now us, now this, but that's not really productive when there's this power discrepancy at play.
I think I agree completely.
I know I agree. Yeah, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff you've written, and I'm going to put your Twitter link down below, and as well as a link to the paper that I'm going to mention here to ask you questions about. We've gone a little longer than I'd expected already, so if you run out of time, just let me know.
I'm in good shape so far.
Oh, you're in good shape so far. Okay, good. So you talk a little bit about in the paper about aggressive tactics can backfire in these types of relationships. So can you talk a little bit about how, like, the things that are happening right now, how this aggressive sort of response may end up backfiring with the goals that agencies claim they have?
Yeah. So I want to be careful of my response to this because there are people far, far better suited than I am to speak to whether tear gas should be deployed and when tear gas should be deployed. And there is a balancing act to be held. I personally, I'm of the persuasion that a lot of the more aggressive stuff that's happening with the protests and with the arguments about these being riots, I I personally think that they're a little over, the responses are a bit over the top, but I want to be clear that that is not my area of expertise. And I would defer to someone like Ed McGuire. I defer to someone else. Owen West is doing some of this conversation on Twitter in particular. They're in a far better place to tell you what is too aggressive and not aggressive. But what I do think I can say, and what I tried to say in that paper, what we tried to say in that paper, was that to make the argument that law enforcement can exist purely coercively, that social control can exist purely coercively, has the potential of making people far more worried about their potential for harm. And so if it's incredibly salient to people that, that there's this potential for injury, even when that injury is used appropriately. So I mean, obviously, if people are constantly being wrongly harmed, you're deep in a I can't get back to trust space. But even when they're being rightly harmed, you're creating a dynamic that history seems to suggest pretty strongly doesn't work super well. Even in the short term, it's not incredibly effective, but definitely not in the long term.
Yeah. And again, on an individual, I always found that, having a good conversation with someone and explaining, I was not always good. When I look back on some of the things I've done and said, and obviously I've made mistakes, but what I found was what I'm more proud of doing and found more effective as a police officer was when you explain to somebody the process that they're going through and the justification for why what's happening is happening. If you say, hey man, I know you're upset. I know you ran from the car and, I had to tackle you and get you in handcuffs and that sucks. And I'm going to treat you fairly now. I'm going to get you some water. I'm going to, make sure you're taken care of. And here's what I'm charging you with. Here's why I'm charging you with it. Here's what you can expect in the future. And if I don't, you let me know if I don't follow through on that, and I'll make sure that I do. It's far more effective than coercion, because coercion, and you'd be able to explain the psychological process is better than I could possibly, but it puts up a wall between two people. It doesn't lend itself to conversation or cooperation.
No, I don't think so. I think that is, I mean, I don't know about anyone else's life, but that is so clear in my own life that the more someone talks to me, the more willing the more willing I am to talk in return. And the more someone is shutting me down and moving me and positioning me, and like you were saying earlier, dealing with me,
Absolutely.
The more that's my interaction, I feel differently about that.
Absolutely. And I mean, no one likes to be managed or dealt with at work. You don't like to be you want to be, allowed to be a part of the process and express yourself and know what's next and be informed about what the processes are that control your life. And just because somebody stole something or, got in a fight doesn't mean that they don't still feel the same way about their future. Maybe they feel more so because they're in this extra vulnerable sort of position.
Yeah.
The power is being exerted on them. Can you talk a little bit? You talk about the classic trust in the paper. You talk about this classic trust model and there's the process-based model of policing. Can you talk about these two models and describe them real briefly?
Yeah, no, totally. So the idea for this paper came out of a debate between myself and the second author, I believe, on the paper, Rick Tranker. I'm pretty sure it's second author. He and I were arguing whether you could more get people's compliance with the law via kind of Tyler's classic, people being treated well makes them feel that there's a greater obligation to obey, that the police are more legitimate, and then that leads to more positive interactions with law enforcement. being kind of the process-based model. And then this argument in the trust literature that the willingness to accept vulnerability comes from assessments of the other, or the trustees' ability, benevolence, and integrity. So ability being their ability to do whatever it is that we're talking about trusting them for, their benevolence being their care and their real willingness to put the interests of the other, of the trustor above their own, and then integrity, adhering to a moral code. And then the personality of the trustor. Those kind of come together to predict that willingness to be vulnerable, which then goes on to predict risk-taking in a relationship. The argument there being that most interactions between agentic or people who can make their own decisions, agentic individuals or people who can make deliberate decisions, require some level of risk. And so if you're going to get to that risk-taking in a relationship, you need that willingness to be vulnerable. So basically, in putting together a book chapter that Rick and I were working on before this article, we argued about who was right, about which would better predict the important outcomes for law enforcement. And so we thought we'd try a study that just pitted them against each other, that pitted kind of this classic Tylerian process-based model with this, Roger Mayer is the name that's usually that's usually talked about for the classic model, but pit them against each other and see which one was a better predictor. And it turns out it's a both and answer, which was obviously incredibly disappointing because I was convinced I was right, but
well, you weren't wrong, so that's good.
You weren't able to say from that.
Right. Yeah. So you have these two models, and you decided to like test to see which one was right, and then you discover that it's both. But maybe you back up a little bit. How did you briefly, just for and maybe put it in terms of someone who's maybe not taken a methods class in graduate school,
Sure.
what were your methods? Like, how did you go about testing that question?
Mm-hmm.
And if you could, just tell us basically, how did you test the question?
Sure. So it was a survey. What we did was we asked people to complete a survey that had a bunch of questions about things that they believed or things that they agreed or disagreed with about themselves in light of law enforcement or about law enforcement itself. So we were asking questions like, in general, do the police treat people fairly? Rick has a section of procedural fairness kinds of questions that ask about, are these people, are they beyond their boundaries? Are they going beyond the boundaries of the law when they're interacting with you? We're asking questions like, do you think the police have ability? Do you think the police care about you? Do they have integrity? And then we asked kind of that traditional legitimacy type normative alignment kind of question. Do they share your values? Do they represent your community? Or do you feel obligated to obey them? And then that trust questions of, are you comfortable? Are you willing to accept the potential that they could make decisions that could impact you? And this is where it probably gets less interesting to someone who hasn't taken a methods class, but basically what we wanted to understand was how that stuff works together, how some of those attitudes move with other attitudes. So when people say they're more likely to believe that the police are procedurally fair, are they also more likely to say the police have more ability? And what we were trying to superimpose on that mess of relationships across these items or these scales was some kind of order, was some kind of this and then this and then this and then this kind of a process to it. And it was in trying to figure out how these things are different or how they're the same. Do we have two different concepts, or are they the same concept in the end? In trying to sort through all of that, it's really where we got towards this integrated framework that ends up being the big contribution of that paper. Was kind of finding that, even though this was a part of the process model, it kind of fits as part of this classic model.
Right.
And really, there's not a big difference between the one in particular that mattered, and it was kind of the pivot point for that paper, was that normative alignment and this idea of trustworthiness aren't really different things. To say that the police share my values and have ability and have benevolence and have integrity, statistically, that's not a different thing. That's all kind of the same assessment. And once you take those two kind of daisy chains and tie them in the middle, you start seeing what looks more like a more uniform process of how people get from one to get from the beginning to the end.
So you got these two proposals for how things could work, and you're like, okay, I'm right. I know how this was going to play. And then you put them together, and as so often happens with in the social sciences, you realize that it's just a lot more complicated, and
Yeah.
they're not necessarily that different. And so you get
Hmm.
this process of sort of mashing them together and then reorganizing it to create this sort of new framework, like this integrated framework where you integrate the
Yeah.
two theories. Can you sort of maybe just briefly just walk us through that what you
The
came
framework.
or yeah the new
Yeah.
framework, what it looks like?
Really quickly, I want to throw out that it's being an academic, the idea that you just throw things into a can and see how they come back
No,
out, and then
I
that
know,
is a
no, no.
paper answer. So just for my own study, I will throw it a little more than that. But to the question, um, basically what we did was we took some pretty well understood ideas in psychology that in order for someone to get to a behavior, you really start out with, with some sort of an assessment. You need some kind of information. You need something that you can draw on. And then once you have that information, you make assessments about what that information needs or means. These are some ideas from social cognition and social psychology, that you make attributions about the person. You make attributions about the relationship, and that those attributions change how you feel and what you believe, and then that's what ultimately decides how you behave with this other person. So making that more concrete in the context of policing, like we tried to do with this model, basically what we argue is that to understand the legitimacy of the police, you start with the information that people have about what policing is and about how it behaves. And we talk about those in terms of interactions, but we do mean that these can be vicarious interactions. And so someone can pull information about what policing is and what it means to interact with law enforcement from how their friend interacted with them. But you start with those evaluations of the interaction with law enforcement. And from that, you start to attribute things about the police. And so if you believe that the police treat people fairly, you're going to start to make more positive assessments of who the police are, what their characteristics are, what they believe, what they are about. And the more positive those evaluations you make of law enforcement are, the more you start to feel differently about them. You start to feel more positive. You start to feel more confident. You start to feel more satisfied. And because it's me, and this is trust, we focus really heavily on people's feeling that willingness to accept vulnerability and kind of use that as a core construct for that part of that stage of the framework. And then once you've gotten to the point where someone is feeling, I feel confident, I feel willing to be vulnerable, I feel satisfied, that feeling, those psychological internalizations facilitate behaviors. And so when someone is faced with a situation where they have to decide how they're going to interact with law enforcement, they are drawing from how they feel and what they've internalized and what they believe about themselves in relationship to law enforcement. And so those are kind of the 4 stages that we argue.
So in the end, it sort of comes down to this sort of, you're bringing the psychological component and putting it in the forefront, and the reality that matters is the individual that's interacting with the police.
That is definitely the psychologist in me, but yeah, no, I don't ever get very far from that perception is reality for the individual world.
And that's why it's so, I think, important for police officers to engage the sociological imagination and be able to and develop the skill set to put themselves in the position of the person they're dealing with, and think how, and be able to make an educated guess as to how they may be interpreting it, because it's the reality of the person that you're interacting with, not dealing with, interacting with, and their reality is what really matters. Like their perspective is what really matters. You also in the
it's what really matters for their behavior.
Right. It's what really, and because we're in this, as a police officer, you're in this power differential. It's not an equal interaction, so it makes sense to me to say, well, you're with, like, one of the things I learned in the military was that when you're in charge of somebody, that you have responsibility for them. So like if you go out to the field for 3 days and you're a private and you've got a corporal that corporal's in charge of you, then it's the corporal's responsibility to make sure that you have food, that you have water, that you have, the things you need to be healthy, and that you're taken care of, including your psychological well-being. They're responsible for you because they have power over you.
Yeah.
When you're a police officer, you have power over this person. You need to, I think you need to recognize that they're vulnerable, that you're in a position, you have control over them, and you need to take care of their welfare. It's important.
Yeah.
You talk about also that, this makes sense, but that there needs to be further development, that you need to develop this idea more. Can you talk about maybe some of the weaknesses or some of the things that need to be parsed out?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and I'm trying to think of a way to put this that is less, a little less egghead. We don't get into cause. There's nothing about the way that we collected this data that would let us convincingly argue that how people evaluate the police is causing how they internalize things about the police, which is causing their behavior. There's absolutely the possibility that people don't feel like they have an option in terms of how they interact with law enforcement. And so their behavior is actually being driven by something outside of themselves entirely. And in order to kind of deal with what we usually call cognitive dissonance, or this mismatch between your behaviors and your attitudes, people have a more positive evaluation of law enforcement because they feel constrained in having to have a more positive behavioral reaction. There's nothing about this paper that, or the data that we collected or the way that we tested it, that would allow us to convincingly say that this is the process. And in fact, in the paper, we try to be really explicit about the fact that for some individuals, they're going to move in different ways through this process. But what we were hoping we could offer to the literature is a way to organize this mess of literature that's trying to understand legitimacy, that everyone's got their own constructs and their own ideas and their own definitions for those constructs and their own orders and how they bring all those pieces together. We wanted to create a structure and a framework for how people can think about those items, recognizing that there's work left to be done on the causal side of this. And there's a great paper by, I believe it's Daniel Megan and Cody Tellep, where they kind of take that literature to task in its causal questions and its ability to actually test cause across procedural fairness to positive behavioral reactions and things like that. So for those who are interested, I highly recommend that paper. But
I'll put a link in the description as well.
It's a good one. I appreciate that. I highly recommend it for those who are interested in that extra question. That is what we offer the literature, is an organizing framework, less than a causal model. And it would be nice to be able to turn that framework into a causal model.
Okay.
Again, it's a bit of a nerdy answer to your question.
No, don't worry. There's a lot of nerds on here too that are geeking out right now.
Yeah.
Having a million questions. So I don't want to take too much of your time. I got just a couple more questions. So I always ask this question, and again, I'm like, I don't know if I should ask it, but I have to ask it. But sure. I'll reshape it a little bit. I always like to ask, well, what does this mean in terms of policy? So what you've discovered sort of be pushed out to push out and impact the world? I'm going to rephrase it and say, are you at a point now where, in your understanding of trust, and I'm interested in policing, and I know that's what you're interested in as well. Is there anything you can suggest? Is there anything that you feel strongly about, or confident saying, like, these are some policies that we should seriously consider? I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
No. It's a totally fair question, and I have an answer. I'm trying to decide if I feel confident enough to say that I'm 100% behind it. It seems like a no-brainer to me that there has to be opportunity for conversation between really any governmental agency and the public it's responsible for, but I think in particular between law enforcement and the public. Where I hesitate is that I don't think the answer to this current moment in that relationship is a bunch of town halls. Like, that is not going to fix this problem at all. But as a matter of policy, to have an opportunity for the public to be heard, I think is a no-brainer for building trust. And that trying to understand how people think about their vulnerability and how people think about their potential for harm and how people think about the police in relation to that potential for harm. If you don't have an avenue for thinking about that, I think you have a pretty significant problem. I do think that the people who need to answer the questions of, is it okay to tear gas at this moment versus that moment? I think that is a more technical question. And that is, I think, a more police reform focused question. And I think that I myself would not feel super confident weighing in on that.
Right.
But if that conversation happens in the absence of an understanding of what people are worried about or think about or care about, you're creating a problem for yourself. And I think that's pretty much going to be true across contexts. So I'm okay stamping it and saying that one's for real.
Right.
I
think
like
that's very reasonable.
I hope that I don't think that one can backfire too badly.
No, and I don't think ever giving opportunities for people to voice their concerns and play a role in shaping the future of the institution. I don't see how that can backfire. I think injecting more democracy now just seems like a good idea to me.
It's definitely being asked for, and the fact that it's being asked for alone makes it worth paying attention to.
Yeah, and if we're scared of more democracy, then we have some very big problems, I think. And we are, and I think that's...
You're not wrong at all.
I think there are a lot of people in this country who are terrified by the idea of allowing the wretched of the earth to control the future of this country. I think when we look at our institutions, they were structured in a way to ensure that certain people did not have a say in shaping things. And it's ironic that the solution to saving the social control mechanism may be allowing the voices of the people that it was designed to control to have I don't know, it's sort of gets my head spinning in a million different ways. Can I just, before I let you go, last question. What I want to do is just sort of turn it over to you and give you a chance to have sort of any parting thoughts, where we are now as a society, for people who are listening to this, what would you like to say? If anything, you've already said a ton and I appreciate it, but just want to give you the last word.
I appreciate it. On a professional level, I think we've kind of covered what I think I can offer, and that is this. There's a house that has to be put in order before it makes any sense to walk someone through it and say, here's what you should think or what you should believe about this. There are real problems, and I understand the pushback of the few bad apples, that they're great people doing great things out there, but I think it would be hard in this moment to miss that it isn't good enough anymore. That sure, it's only a few people doing really terrible things, but it's a few people doing really terrible things, and that's a problem, and that needs to be addressed. So to the extent that I'm speaking to your audience and inserting myself into kind of a last word, taking that seriously is, I think, critical. And I'm not in a position to tell anyone what that means, but really trying to understand that this has to be better. It has to be better than what it is. There's no other, I can't help you if you can't get to the point where this is a better thing. None of the work that I'm doing trying to understand trust, none of the briefings or the PowerPoints or the presentation, none of this is going to help you if those real issues aren't seriously dealt with, and the impact is different. Just to say that we sent another 40 officers through an implicit bias training is not an outcome. And I'm on a little bit of a loop, so I'll stop there. But the real changes has to happen.
I don't think you could have said it any better, and we'll leave it there. I just again wanted to thank you. I know this is like a stressful time for everybody. I really appreciate, and everyone listening really appreciates your time. Good luck with your endeavors, and thank you again.
Thank you for the invitation. I love these conversations. They're fun.